All right, guys, so here I got a big old billet of Damascus, and we're gonna try out a new style of Damascus that's been going around called Gradient Damascus. Now, I seen a video by Neil Kamimura, and I basically just copied pretty much his layout with the amount of steel I had. It's a little bit less than what he used, but that's okay. We have a big old billet. It's over 5 inches tall. And so we're going to go on ahead and clean it up and tack it together, and we'll get started. It's a big boy. All right, guys, I want to take a quick moment to talk to you about how this billet is set up before I go on ahead and weld it, because I don't want the colors to be, burnt out, and then I don't really know what's going on here. So my first 5 pieces, 6 pieces are 1084, followed by one 15 and 20, then three 1084, then one 15 and 20, then two 1084, then one 15 and 20, then one 1084, then two 15 and 20, then one 1084, then two 15 and 20, then one 1084, then three 15 and 20, then one 1084, then three 15 and 20, then one 1084, then two 15 and 20, two 1084, and then one 15 and 20, and one 1084. So the plan is to work this down. We have approximately 5 inches. We have 4 3/4 here. And so we're gonna work that down to 2 inches by 2 inches by however long it is. Then we're gonna re-square it at a bias, which means at a 90-degree, we're gonna re-square it. That way we can make some C's in here. And then from there, I'll follow up on you guys with what we're gonna do afterwards. This is a huge billet. I'm not sure exactly. I'm pretty sure only half of this billet is going to be used in this video, and I'll probably save the other half for a different pattern down the line. So let's go on ahead and start welding this bad boy up. Alright, guys, so I had to make these special dies just to be able to fit the billet, because the billet was too big for my normal dies. So I made these guys off screen, and because I wanted to press the whole billet at once, so it had to be a little bit longer as well. Fortunately, those big dies also work for a lot more things, so they came in handy for multiple builds. So I had to work it with just one until I got it small enough to fit with both underneath, which is about 4 and a change, probably 4 1/4, and then I could work it down. But at this point, this billet is getting long and it's extremely heavy. Unfortunately, I did not weigh it before I started, but it was definitely the biggest and heaviest billet I've worked with so far, and honestly, it was pretty unmanageable. After I cut it in half, it was a lot easier to be able to work on it, and it got up to heat a lot faster, which made it a lot more malleable as well. And the goal of the forging right here is to try to work it down to about a 2" by 2" block. That way I can knock in the corners and do my initial C's. The other portion of the billet, the other half, I put to the side, and I will be using it for another build here in the near future, where instead of making a mosaic, I do a twist Damascus, and just to see how the pattern turns out and the gradient that I was working with. And hopefully that turns out pretty cool. But here I'm starting to knock in those corners, and the reason why I put on a square tubing instead of the regular rebar that I used was to be able to keep track of where my corners were, because it's pretty tricky whenever you knock in the corners. If you're not paying very close attention to where your new corners are, you can mistake them for your old corners that are slightly pressed, and then you're kind of undoing your work. So as a safety, I used a square tubing. Ideally, I should have used a solid square, but I didn't have any at the time, so I just made do with what I had. And now that I have it squared off, all I'm going to do is work it into a rectangle, and from there I can restack it to be able to make my C's into W's. Also, for the record, I'm relatively new to doing mosaics and doing C's and doing W's and stuff, so I probably make mistakes along the way. I definitely do later towards the build, and I'll call them out once we get there. But I tried to go back and forth between other videos of other makers making the Mosaic Damascus as a reference. That way I could get the majority of it done right, or to the best of my abilities. Now that I have the billet cut into 4 identical pieces, I'm going and checking my pattern with a little bit of ferric chloride to make sure that I make them into an actual W and I don't accidentally flip one the wrong way and ruin all the progress so far. Whenever you're making mosaics or anything like this, you definitely have to make sure everything is as aligned and as symmetrical as possible. That way you get the intended result. If not, it's very easy to mess up and ruin a lot of steel and multiple hours of work. Fortunately, this billet did fit in my press, and I was able to forge it down pretty easily. And what I'm looking forward to doing now is to forge it down again close to the 2" by 2" block, and then I'll knock in the corners one more time. That way I can turn it from W's into crushed W's. Now that I have it roughly the size that I wanted, it's actually a little bit under 2 by 2. I'm going in with my squaring dies and I'm knocking in those corners. The first way I did it was just with the flat dies, but I didn't feel like I did a good job. So I decided to try it out with the squaring dies this time, and then go in with the flat dies and crew up those sides and those corners. That way I get a better, more consistent resquaring. And one thing to notice is the edges always fray. They always split open whenever you're forging the corners in, because it just doesn't want to stick, and you're applying a lot of force to those corners that really have nothing to hold them together. So whenever you're making a mosaic, there is definitely a lot of loss with those edges, as well as material loss through forging and through cutting off the ends just to restack and resquare, which is one of the reasons why mosaics are so expensive, because they are time consuming and there's a lot of loss in material. for this particular billet, I only cleaned up the inner sides that are going to actually forge well together. That way I could save some time. And I used some zip ties to hold everything together because I couldn't find clamps that I could use. And I had some zip ties lying around, so I figured that would be a great option, and it worked pretty well. Ideally, I should weld in all the seams as well, but I figured since this is an earlier stage, I could skip that. Though honestly, for future builds, I think I'm gonna go on ahead and weld all the seams to make sure I have an airtight weld to make sure that we run into the least amount of possible problems. And now that everything is forge welded nicely, I'm going to work it down to a 1" by 1" block. That way I can cut 4 identical pieces again, and I can 4-way it again. That way I can increase the pattern that's on the inside of the billet. With the billet forged down, all I'm going to do now is straighten it up with my longer dies and make sure all my edges are nice and straight. Here's a look at the pattern. You can't really see it very well. It's really hard to be able to etch it, but it is a bit of a star pattern I was going for. It didn't quite come out the way I wanted it, to be frank. That's why I ended up resquaring it a few more times, hoping that getting a smaller, tighter pattern would be able to make it pop better than having a bit of a wonky starish pattern. Though for my next mosaic, I'm definitely going to try to make more of a bold pattern, and I have a little bit of work I need to do on my press. Currently, it has one of its supports cracked, and therefore it's pressing pretty unevenly, and it's losing a bit of power in the press. So I need to take some time to fix that and readjust a lot of different things on the press just to be able to make it better and fine-tune it for doing very precise presses versus how it is right now, where I'm not doing very precise presses. They are slightly skewed towards the left where it presses a little bit tighter. But granted, I did make this press by myself, and I have no idea what I'm doing or what I was doing at that time. So slowly it started as version 1, then version 2, then version 3. I think we're on version 3 right now. I might make it version 4 or maybe 3.1, depending on how many changes I make. So ideally I should have stopped here and just forged it into a rectangle to do my tiling. The pattern looks pretty good, but I wanted to see if I could get it tighter and if it would look a little bit better. I shouldn't have. I ended up losing material to cutting off the ends and doing all the other stuff that I tend to do. But because I ended up resquaring it one more time, I ended up with a much tighter pattern than I would have originally. So here I'm just making a rectangle. I'm going with a 1 by 1.5. I wasn't sure what dimensions I actually needed to be able to make this work. I did learn a lot in this process, and next time I will be actually making it almost the finished dimensions of the knife for the width. So here I'm doing a process called tiling. I pretty much cut them at an angle 35 degrees, and I'm layering them side by side. That way I can reforge on that angle. And this is how we bring out the pattern that's on the inside to the outside of the knife. But as I was saying before, one thing that I did learn here is that I need to make them a lot wider. Here they're about 1.25 inches wide. Ideally, I need to make it about 2 inches wide. That way I can have about a 2.25 inch knife, 2.5 inch knife at the heel versus what I ended up with, which was probably about 1.25 inches. And for the record, these little tiles that I cut, they are cut to about 1/2 inch of thickness. So once if everything forge welds and the welds down, it comes out probably like roughly around a little bit under 1/4. One thing I also did for this billet particularly is that I spray painted the 2 pieces of steel that I ended up welding up to it, in the hopes that that would help me be able to remove the steel a lot easier and avoid the struggle that I went through on the last mosaic that I made from a canister with some bolts or some nuts. I don't remember. Nonetheless, I struggled quite a bit to get that off, and so I decided to go on ahead and do the white spray paint. And though it did take some work and I ruined a screwdriver in the process because I couldn't find a chisel to be able to chisel it off, it came out pretty easily, all things considered. And with the outer layer off, I decided to go back into the forge and work it down a little bit and get a more consistent, even finish on it. And I had the bright idea to try to forge out a tang. That way I could have a bigger knife, or possibly 2 knives if I forge out the other end into a tang as well. And that did not go so well. The steel was already too thin and it began cracking in the center. So I opted out for just doing a stock removal knife out of it. That way I did not end up warping or damaging the mosaic pattern that I had at this point spent weeks on my free time while doing other videos making. With the rough shape cut out, I go to the 2x72 to true everything up. I try to use the most amount of steel as possible, and I essentially just cut in a tip and remove the little bit that I needed to remove to make the tang an actual tang. And all things considered, I think I got pretty good yield out of my billet. And just to do a quick recap, I started with a 6-inch by 2-inch wide by almost 5-inch tall billet that I ended up cutting in half, which left us with a 3 by 2 by almost 5-inch tall billet that after I was done with all the different forge welds and all the cutoffs that I ended up doing, I ended up with this one 8-inch knife that is about 1/8 thick, which goes to show the actual amount of material loss that is in making mosaics. But not to worry, I did save, I think, all of the cutoffs that I ended up cutting off the edge. I will be cleaning those up and throwing them into a graveyard Damascus in the near future. So with all my pinholes drilled, it's ready to take a quick bath in some oil, and the quench goes pretty successful. I have very minor to basically no warping, which made me a very happy boy. Alright, so we're at a temper. The knife came out pretty good. You can see that pattern popping out through there. I think it looks pretty nice. So we're going to go ahead and put it on the surface grinder, and we're going to go ahead and clean all this up, get back to nice clean steel, and we're going to start on our grind. Overall, it's going to be a pretty good size little breaking knife. One quick confession I want to make to you guys while I am grinding down the profile on this knife. It's quite embarrassing, but the truth is that this knife could have been a little bit bigger. I actually, once I was sweeping the floor after I ended up doing all this grinding, I actually found a piece of a tile that I had lost. I remember that whenever I was laying it out, I was looking for tile number 7 and I just couldn't find it. So I ended up just assuming that I misnumbered my tiles when I was cutting them. And so I just renumbered them and called it what it was. But while I was sweeping, I ended up finding tile number 7 conveniently on the floor behind my anvil, which is right where I do most of my cutting on the vertical bandsaw. And at that point, I couldn't even get mad. All I could do was laugh about the situation. Alright guys, so I'm done hand sanding. We're up to 800 grit, so we're going to go ahead and start on the handle. So this is a piece of burl wood. It is Australian. It turns like in a really nice orange color. I don't quite know the name of it. If you know what it is, let me know in the comments down below. I was told, but I forgot. We're going to be pairing this with some black liners and some black pins, and I think it's going to make a pretty good contrast with the mosaic pattern we got in there. It's going to be a pretty busy knife, but I think it's going to balance out pretty nicely. Let's go on ahead and get started. Alright guys, so a quick background on this wood. I actually bought a very nice slab of it, cookie I guess they would call it, from my local hardwood supplier where I get the majority of my handle material that I then get stabilized by my buddy Mike, and he does a really good job and it helps me out with all the stabilization. And I wanted to shout out his page real quick. It's in the link in the description down below. Mike Alchua. He makes handle material that he sells online, and he makes some really good handle material that I use a lot in my previous builds, as well as all the handle material that I've been using recently on most of my builds. He stabilized all of it, so definitely go check out his page. It's in the description down below. He has a lot of really nice handle material, and I really appreciate if you check out his work. Now back to this bandsaw. It was chattering a lot a few videos ago. Turns out it had a bearing that had fallen out and I accidentally probably trashed. So after I found that out and I put a brand new blade on it, it's been working very well, and I'm very happy with the cutting performance that it has. Truthfully, I found an old roll of tape that was no longer good from sitting so long. It glued itself together, so I ran it through my older bandsaw blade, and it kind of gummed it up and ruined the teeth. And I did that because I am a curious guy and I wanted to see what it looked like. So that ruined the blade completely, plus the bearing really ended up making it quite dangerous to use. So I've got that fixed up now. So now we're moving up to our glue up. Here I'm using some black G10 pins that will complement well with the black liners that I'm using. And the reason why I use those black liners is so I can paint the regular wood with nail polish to be able to protect it while I etch the whole knife, because I am a fan of etching the spine and the handle all the way around the knife to be able to bring out all of that Damascus, because I personally think that making a really nice Damascus knife but then not etching the spine and the handle on these full tang knives is kind of a waste. It is a lot more work and it is a bigger pain to be able to get all that sanded down as fine as I do on the rest of the knife, but it's definitely well worth it once we get our etch and our coffee etch. And that's not to throw any shade at people who don't go this route and end up just grinding it off. It's really just an aesthetic thing, and to each their own. I would say, you know, you're making your knife, do it however you want to do it. But me personally, I like to go this route because I feel like it gives a better overall design. But at the same time, I do very simple handles that don't have a lot of anything to it. For example, on this handle, all I'm doing is giving it a slight taper, well, a pretty big taper, and then rounding over all the edges so it's nice and comfy. That is my style. That is what I like to do. Other people like to go in with geometry and all kinds of crazy stuff. I don't really like to do that. But I guess art is subjective and you really can do whatever you want. It is your knife. And I'm just hoping somebody ends up liking it and buying it. And if not, then I get to keep a really cool knife made the way I wanted to make it. Onto the sharpening, I like to use my 2x72 at about 15% with a worn 220 grit belt, and this helps me establish that edge and pull off that burr. Once that burr is nice and even, I like to go with a diamond plate 1000 grit and I clean it up. Afterwards, I go to a leather strop, and that's pretty much what I do, and I get the knives nice and sharp. This one was incredibly sharp because of the thin profile. Overall, I was very happy with the way it turned out. And here's a final look at the result. I really like the way it turned out, though I'm not the happiest with the pattern because it didn't quite turn out the way I had imagined. Overall, it was a very fun experience, and I still really like the way the pattern turned out. And I feel like I didn't quite get the orange I was looking for in the wood. Nonetheless, I still think it looks really good in that darker tone orange. And I like the way the Damascus pops out all the way around the spine and the handle of the knife. Overall, I'm extremely happy with the way it turned out, and I will be doing a lot more mosaics in the future. And if you're interested in being the owner of this knife, it is available on my website the moment this video came out. It will be pricier than my usual knife, but it also took me a lot more work and a lot more time to make. But as always, guys, I really appreciate you watching. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will catch y'all on the next one. Peace.